Hi everyone, it's Fred again from Notes of a Nomad, video number 227. As I go through a lot of the items I have as I try and downsize, I found a folder with some notes written by my father. Now, my father didn't go to a lot of schooling. I think he might have finished elementary school, but he had to leave the home relatively young because he was the oldest and there was too many mouths to feed. But he did write some notes and he often told some stories. I found some of these notes here. They're written on yellow paper in pencil, so they're not very clear, but I managed, and they're pretty faded, but I managed to decipher most of it. And one of them was a story that he often told, and I have more details about the story he mentioned back in 1930. So I thought I would share this story because, as I've indicated before, these Notes of a Nomad videos may be of interest to some historian 100 years from now. So let's tell the story that my father used to talk about from the 1930s. Now, in these notes as well, before I start that story, he mentioned some other things about some of the prices and how much they earned, like 25 cents a dollar, sorry, 25 cents an hour was a big pay increase that the government voted in I believe it was the 1930s, early 1930s, when he wrote some notes about that. And he wrote other items. There was an item about truck drivers were earning $4 a week, with raises going up to $7 a week if they weren't fired after 3 months. But very few truck drivers were earning $7 a week, but they would start at $4 a week. Wow. And I remember him telling us some of the things what they cost. And I think his first suit was a couple dollars. So those were some of the notes that he had in those yellow faded legal pages written in pencil. He always wrote things in pencil because he said, I'm not very good at spelling and I make mistakes, so I have to erase them. So anything he ever wrote, I always saw was in pencil, never wrote in ink. And these notes, I weren't aware they existed until I started going through some old papers and I found a few pages. Now, the story he told about 1930s, and I often heard this, but there's more details than I knew. It was a 1925 uh, Ford Model T. And my dad spoke about that quite often, but he didn't mention the car. And this happened in 1930. And there's a picture of my dad when he was relatively young with some fish. And what he often used to do was he went fishing. But apparently, his stepfather, as he called in his notes, the old man, bought a 1925 Ford Model T in 1930. And he told this story in his writing about the Model T arriving at nighttime and was parked behind the back steps of the house. And the kids eventually went exploring. But the stepfather was at work and they were exploring the car and got to know some of the uh, fixtures in the car. And some of the fixtures were the magnetos. So this was a picture of a Model T 1925 touring car. According to my dad's notes, the cover that is on the back of this didn't exist on their car. And he paid $15 for this car. Now, these cars were over a couple $100 when they were new in 1925. 5 years later, apparently, his stepfather bought this car for $15. And the reason he bought it was to go fishing because they wanted to go to places outside of town. They could only fish at the river in town or next to the town. Now, with a car, they could go farther out of town and find rivers that people weren't fishing on. So that's why he bought the car. Now, the stepfather was introduced by the children to there's four wooden boxes to under this by the steering wheel to the right side of the steering wheel of the car. And these four boxes were the magnetos. And the magnetos was what you adjusted for each of the four cylinders. So the spark plugs, and you would adjust it that it would fire the spark plugs at the right time, and the engine would run smoother. So you could adjust each one of the magnetos for each spark plug for each cylinder. And that was underneath the dashboard to the right side. And so stepfather, the old man, was exploring one day before he even started to drive, and he was tuning them and saying, oh, this is how this works. And unfortunately, he touched the metal dashboard when he was trying to adjust, and he got a shock. And this car became, as my father wrote, his mortal enemy. He was so scared of this car and getting shocks of it. So what happened apparently one day, and my father always told this story, they had gone fishing, and as they had finished their fishing trip, they were coming back home, and they were going down a steep hill when all of a sudden the old man put his hands up in the air, took his hands off the steering wheel, and said, I got a shock, I got a shock. There's something, and it shocked me in my leg, the car. Meanwhile, it wasn't the car, it was the picnic basket next to his leg on the floor, and it had a broken, it was a wicker basket, and it had a sharp point that was sticking into his leg. And that was the cause of this shock that caused him to take his hands off the steering wheel, and the car was going down a hill. And my father said they thought they were all going to die. Now, he didn't write in here, that's where he ended the story, but he didn't tell me, well, they didn't die. So I don't know who grabbed the wheel, but that was the story my father often told about the old man thinking he had a shock, when meanwhile it was a piece of the wicker basket was poking into his leg. So that was the most popular story that my dad always used to talk about. Now that I know, the 1925 Ford Model T touring car that I guess my step grandfather, if you want to call that, had bought for $15 in 1930. So there's a story, and that's what cars look like. That car is almost 100 years old. And that's what cars look like 100 years old ago. In 1925, that car was built. So with that, I'll say adios, au revoir, wishing you, your family, and friends. I hope you have lots of stories to share, and that the historians in 100 years from now will say, look at what cars look like, and look at what happened when they had magnetos, etc., and they got shocks if they weren't careful when they were driving their cars. So bye for now. Au revoir. Wishing you, your family, and friends lots of love and laughter. Until next time, from Fred and Notes of a Nomad.